I think it's an important conversation to be having about how relationships among races in this country can be driven, influenced, and shaped by all forms of government policy, including economic policy. And joining us now to discuss that topic with us is Professor Andre L. Smith. He is an associate professor of law at Widener Law School in Wilmington, Delaware. He teaches classes and produces scholarship regarding federal taxation, administrative law, and related fields, as well as sports and entertainment law. His book, published in 2015, is entitled Essays on the Relationship Between Tax Law and Racial Economic Justice, Black Tax, and he has also recently written a paper on government financing and Black Lives Matter. Professor Smith, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for your research in these areas, which I've been finding very interesting. Let's talk a little bit, if you would, about your paper entitled How Bad Tax Policies Helped Kill Mike Brown, How Starving the Beast Created the Black Lives Matter Movement. What do you mean by that? What is the relationship there?
Okay, well, let me first give appropriate credit to researchers Bob Lord and Karen Dolan out of the Institute of Policy Studies. They originally wrote a piece entitled "Will Any Presidential Candidate Connect Federal Tax Policy and Police Killings?" They contacted me with the article that they had written. I believe it's on their website. Again, that's the Institute of Policy Studies. I looked at it. I was actually somewhat skeptical when I first heard the title about tax policy and police killings being connected. And when you invoke the name of Mike Brown, you really don't want to exploit or appropriate a tragedy such as this. So I was a little skeptical at first. But when I read the paper, I thought they were just on point. That the connection is essentially this. When we reduce tax revenue, they focused on federal tax revenue, but my essay focuses just on all the ways in which we've reduced the amount of tax revenue we've collected. When we reduce tax revenue, that means we either have to close the programs that tax revenue supports, or we're going to have to get that revenue from somewhere else. More specifically, when the federal government doesn't collect as much revenue as it used to, which is what's going on, then they can't subsidize the states as much as they used to. The states can't subsidize the local communities as much as they used to. We've seen this in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and Arizona, et cetera. Which means, again, these municipalities are going to have to raise that revenue in alternative ways. The way in which some municipalities have chosen to raise that revenue, including in Ferguson, Missouri, is by hyper-aggressive code enforcement, municipal codes such as improper registering bicycles, blinds on window blinds. And the collection, we've seen in other parts of the country, debtors' prisons and what have you to collect money from poor people. And so when we have an inadequate, so the connection is this: if we have an inadequate revenue to fund government and we seek to heap those costs on poor people, we're going to see more clashes between law enforcement and poor people, black or otherwise. That, to me, is in a real sense how tax policy contributed to the killing of Mike Brown and has led to this Black Lives Matter. I guess we could wrap a bow around when we say bad tax policy. I guess I'm comfortable being more precise in saying that the strategy that has been employed for the last 10, 15 years, we used to hear it called starving the beast. We don't hear that term much anymore, but I do believe that's what we're experiencing, where conservative strategists believe that even conservative politicians don't have the will to cut social programs, that they're too popular, that they face a backlash in politics, and they would get kicked out of office. So understanding that they believe that social programs can't be cut outright through legislation, the way to remove them or at least whittle them down to being ineffective is to starve the government of the revenue it needs to create these well-functioning programs.
We're
Again, just
talking
want
to
to.
Professor Andre L. Smith and about the relationship between financial and tax policy and Black Lives Matter. You know, Professor Smith, when the protests were going on in Ferguson, we covered them very extensively here on the program. We sent a couple folks out there. We did a lot of interviews and so on. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand when you talk about this collection of revenue for things like improper bicycle licensing or traffic stops or even pedestrian stops and so on. In a city like Ferguson, the amount of, if you look at the statistics, I don't have them at my fingertips now, but I know you've looked at them. The fines amount to like several fines levied per person per year, and the amounts get to be quite significant. So I think part of what you're saying is that this is a redistributive effort here, that when they cut
Mhm.
taxes for people who are making good money or significant money, significant income, they make up the difference by taking dispossessed communities to a large extent, marginalized communities, and draining the money out of them through these types of police activities, right?
Sure. In tax policy, we would call this a regressive tax situation,
Yes.
right? That
Hmm.
that we believe we've set up our tax system to be progressive. That the wealthier you are, the higher rates, not just the higher amount, but the higher rate of your income you should pay. Again, we could get into diminishing marginal returns and the justifications for it, but that's essentially we assume that those who have done well in our society, again, that's what we expect, right? If we pay for government, we want to do well based on what the government provides, the infrastructure, the military, et cetera. So it's only right that those who do best pay the most. However, again, that's controversial in political circles, right? That the wealthy simply just don't want to pay, with just as profit maximizers seek to just reduce their tax bill, regardless of what the theory or the justification or what tax fairness requires. And so, on the one hand, we already know that sales taxes and whatnots are ways in which we can fund government that avoids progressive taxation, that a sales tax is pretty regressive. Well, this is even worse than that, right? This is as far as involuntary extractions directly from people who we know can't afford to pay. I mean, by definition, as poor people, you don't have extra money around to pay
Right.
fines for improperly registered bicycles. So, to the extent we need revenue to pay for government, whether it comes from taxes, whether it comes from fees, whether it comes from fines. We can all call those transaction costs in a very general sense. And yes, what we're saying is that it's being asymmetrically, the burden of funding government is being placed asymmetrically on poor people and even poor black people.
And what you also find, I think, and the through line to the Black Lives Matter movement, Professor Smith, is that not only is this a highly regressive tax, but it's one that's enforced through the mechanism of police arrests, which, especially in minority communities, carries a high risk of violence.
Right. And again, because it's historical, it's not something that's new. It's something that's being exacerbated. So you already had a situation for years, decades, perhaps even centuries, where there's already been that tension. And then to add on this starve the beast mentality and put us in an era where our infrastructure is crumbling, where our public schools are being unfunded, it lights a fire to the powder keg that's already been. We can go all the way back to the 18th century, the 19th century, Stono's Rebellion, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, that we've always had a system in which when government seems to need more money and we can't extract more revenue from the wealthy, that extra taxes and fees seem that poor communities, and particularly poor black communities, tend to be a vulnerable place to extract rents. I mean, this goes all the way back to the taxation on slavery itself. We had in the southern states before the Civil War, over half of many southern states' budget came from taxing slavery, which means taxing slave owners, slave traders, brokers, etc., and also free blacks. And when you raise those taxes to hire slave patrols on the one hand, which is reminiscent of what's going on today, and also that also requires the slave owner to make the slave more productive. If you're hiring if you're raising taxes. So once again, balancing the budget on the backs of black people can cause death back then and apparently now as well. It's also too reminiscent as far as the folks, those that are involved in the clashes. Again, I know we're straying a little bit from tax policy, but when we talk about the Zimmermans and the police officers that are not penalized, again, this is a historical reference. There was not just a stark fact is that from the Civil War till 1960, there had been only one white person convicted of killing a black person in the state of Georgia. That's almost 100 years, and that person had to kill 11 people.
Now, it almost, Professor Smith, it almost follows, doesn't it? I mean, if you, in a sense, if you create a system of financing that depends on the exploitation of African Americans and the use of a police force to, in a sense, extract these funds, it almost follows that you have to devalue black lives in order to do that, because that's inevitably going to lead to violence, conflict, and death. And if you sensitize yourself to that reality, then your system of funding collapses. So isn't there almost a kind of causal relationship here?
Oh, I think it's very direct. It's extremely direct. I mean, on both sides. On the one hand, if you're let's put ourselves in the mind of the police officer and the person that's being approached. When you're talking about consistent clashes, and you're talking about a situation where individuals who are being subjected are already in a state of economic fragility. And what you're doing is you're adding, again, another sense of hopelessness and subordination. To know that you're already underwater, to know that you're already insolvent, and then here comes a police officer, and the very best you can get out of this situation is another fine, then that the frustration level just boils over. And if you're a cop or you're a police officer, how do you not see that? Right?
Right.
If you're aware of what's going on, you see the frustration, you see the anger, and it's and you can't direct it at some policy strategist in Washington D.C. It's going to be directed at the police officer in front of the person. So it is a setup where both sides are clashing with each other when they. I hate to say pawns on a chessboard, but again, if we look back historically, poor white people did not own slaves and therefore did not really support slavery. They basically, in almost every jurisdiction, tried to pass tax laws that raised the taxes on slavery to basically kick slavery out. We call it the abolitionist taxes, and what have you. So, because if one of the misconceptions about slavery is that blacks were only on plantations. No, slaves worked as vendors, as blacksmiths, etc. And if the slave was a blacksmith, a poor white guy can't be the blacksmith.
Right.
If a plantation owner is expanding his plantation on the backs of slaves, that raises the value of the land, and yeoman farmers suffer. So poor whites have always been I guess you could say set against or pitted against poor blacks, in the sense that when you had wealthy back then, the trade-off is that no, we will hire you as slave patrols. We will hire you as
Mm.
overseers. So there's a basically a payoff, or for lack of a better word, a bribe, and also the promise of social supremacy to get poor whites to go along with the program. And we see that here, where again, the promise of security, the promise of more jobs. We see, instead of funding education in urban cities, we see the funding of prisons. $400 million for a prison, which again is going to construction, which is going to
Absolutely.
jobs, which is going to security personnel. So the payoff in basically ignoring the crumbling infrastructures in urban settings and what have you is again employment, as it always has been. So by not paying into the pot what it costs to have a civilized society, unfortunately, wealthy people have mobile technology that allows them to escape the fray, while the rest of us have to deal with declining domestic tranquility.
So, and final question for you, Professor Smith. So, given the systemic nature of this problem, the solution has to be systemic too, right? The solution has to be, among other things, a more egalitarian and progressive taxation system and an understanding of what that means for us becoming a more equal society, right?
Right, right. I think that's exactly where my work tries to lead. That you can't actually call America a meritocracy. You can't actually call it a land of opportunity. You can't say that the market is determining wealth if the market is skewed one way or the other. And if tax policy is which is a huge part of the structure of the marketplace, if tax policy and funding policy and public financing policy is asymmetrically skewed against black people, if it's asymmetrically skewed against poor people, if it's asymmetrically skewed against women or Muslims or whomever, then your claim to meritocracy fails. And it's not just a theoretical claim, it's obvious to the rest of the world. So when you say that you're the moral leader of the world, but yet your economy and your social system doesn't reflect it, then whatever you were trying to gain by promoting yourself as the moral leader of the world is pretty much going to fail. So a more progressive policy is necessary. But let me also say this, because I don't want to, I'm not Pollyannish, I'm not utopic. And so I do understand that in these times, it's a really special challenge because we have this race to the bottom all around the world. The interesting thing about mobile technology is that we can basically be anywhere in the world, and therefore people, wealthy corporations and businesses have choices as to which jurisdiction, and they're using that to have these jurisdictions compete against each other and lower the taxes everywhere. We see it around the country. We see it in states, we see it in cities, that in order to try to attract
Oh, yeah.
businesses and employment, that we're lowering these taxes on the short run, but in the long term, we're allowing our infrastructure, educational and otherwise, to crumble. And so
And
there has to be,
unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there because we're coming up against a hard stop. But
sure,
this is
sure.
such important work, and it's so important for people to understand that these policies actually affect lives and sometimes cost lives. So we very much appreciate your work in this area, Professor Andre L. Smith, and we very much appreciate your coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.